As of early 2023, out of the 193 member states of the UN, 19 had women as heads of government. 174 had men. When it comes to heads of state, excluding monarchies, 17 out of 151 nations had women in office. That represents just around 10%. We can look closer at the 10 most populous nations in the world, starting with China. It has had 8 chairmen or presidents since 1949, all men. Out of its current 24 cabinet ministers, only 1 is a woman. India have had 14 prime ministers since the late 1800s. 1 has been a woman. India has also had 14 presidents in the same time period. 2 have been women. Out of its 30 current cabinet ministers, only 2 are women. The United States have elected 45 men as presidents and no woman. 5 out of its 15 cabinet ministers are women as of today. Indonesia have had 7 presidents since 1945, 6 men and 1 woman. 6 out of its 29 cabinet ministers are women. Pakistan has had 13 presidents since 1956, all men, and 23 prime ministers, 22 men and 1 woman. Nigeria has had a variety of military or democratic leadership, but out of its 15 presidents, all have been men. Brazil has had 39 presidents since 1891, including 1 woman. Bangladesh has had 15 presidents since 1971, all men. Out of the 12 prime ministers, 2 have been women. None of Russia's 10 prime ministers or 4 presidents since 1991 has been women, nor were there any women in those positions during the Soviet era. Mexico has had 15 presidents since 1934, all men. Smaller nations have been better at electing female leaders, but few nations have had more than 1 or 2 women elected. Since there are so many differing political systems throughout the world, it is hard to make a comprehensive list of all female heads of state or government. You can find some notes in the description, but the list used for this video include 125 women. 9 nations have 3 women on the list. The UK, Moldova, New Zealand and Poland have all elected 3 female prime ministers. Haiti, Iceland and Lithuania have had 2 prime ministers and 1 president. And for India and Trinidad and Tobago, it is the other way around. Finland is the only nation with 4, 1 president and 3 prime ministers. Overall, the list is dominated by European nations, with 55 women. Asia has 22, Africa 18. North America, together with Central America and the Caribbean, 15. South America 9, and Oceania 6. In total, 81 current sovereign nations are on the list, meaning that 112 nations on Earth have never elected a woman to either head of state or head of government. When it comes to cabinet ministers, 8 nations have more women than men. Albania currently has the highest in the world, with 66% women. The cabinet of 5 nations are split right down the middle, with 50% men and women. And in 177 nations, there are more men than women as ministers. 17 of those have more than 40% women. In 24 nations, there are just 1 woman, and in 9, there are none at all. In total, globally, 23% of cabinet ministers are women. The most common portfolios for women include gender equality, family and children's affairs, and a selection of other positions involving social affairs, culture and the environment. When it comes to finance, transport, energy, defense, agriculture, trade and justice, the numbers are the lowest, around 10 to 20%. We can move on to parliamentary representation. 3 nations have more women than men in their parliament: Rwanda, Cuba and Nicaragua. In Mexico, New Zealand and the UAE, it is split 50-50. And in 180 nations, there are more men than women in parliament. Of those, 23 have above 40% women. In 6 nations, there are less than 5% women. And in Yemen, there are 245 parliament members, all men. When it comes to regional differences, the number for the Americas is the highest, with 35%. Europe has 31%, Sub-Saharan Africa 26%, Oceania 23%, Asia 21%, and the Middle East and Northern Africa 16%. But there aren't just poor nations or majority Muslim nations towards the bottom. Japan has 416 men in their parliament and just 46 women. Hungary has 173 men and 26 women. India has 460 men and 86 women. Research analyzing the representation of women at a local level of politics are slightly higher, at 36% in 2020. Yet here, only 2 nations had more than 50% women, Antigua and Barbuda and Bolivia, while 131 nations had more than 50% men. So what to make of this? When looking at the list of the women elected to the highest political offices, it is clear that it is improving. More women are being elected today than 20, 40 or 60 years ago. But still today only 26% of parliament members are women globally, and 23% of cabinet ministers are, and just 10% of the world's heads of state or government are women. So the point of this video is not really to define the quality of female versus male leaders, political or otherwise. That's for someone else to do. And I know that I am coming from a perspective of a nation, Sweden, that has a long history of being a front-runner on these issues, and that elected its first female prime minister all the way back in 2021. And that she was in office for 10 months before losing the election in 2022. So we have still to elect our first female prime minister through a general election. But I guess those 10 months still counts as something, am I right? So I mean, with the experience from a totally other part of the world, where female empowerment is still a recent movement, with great progress still to be made, electing a woman to a specific political office might not be your priority. And of course, in many ways, who is carrying that title doesn't mean anything if it does not result in any real change. It is by definition just a symbol. But it might be a symbol of some real change. And I think that's what I'm trying to convey here. That there is progress in the fact that a woman can be elected. It is progress if someone from an ethnic minority or with a disability can be elected. It is progress if someone with a sexual orientation that varies from the norm can be elected. But the emphasis here is on the can. It doesn't mean that every nation will and must for there to be some change in that nation. There are for sure examples of male leaders driving great changes when it comes to gender equality. But on the other hand, if you have a nation that repeatedly elects male leaders, that lack even one woman in its long line of heads of government or state, that is also a sign of something. In a nation where power is equal between men and women, that electoral coin should sometimes land female side up. The most common comment on videos regarding women's political representation is, "What does it matter? I don't care who is the president, just elect the best suited for the job." Which is of course a very fair standpoint, but it is incorrect if you ask me for at least 2 reasons. It is almost impossible to compare the outcome from women or men in office, because we can never have a control group. There is no way to know how a crisis or economic development or legislative agenda would have turned out if the president or prime minister would have been of the other gender. There are research that point to that nations with female leaders do better in peace processes, and that gender equality rises more than what could be expected when women are in office, and that women allocate a higher level of budget on developmental issues, including research from Nobel Prize laureate Esther Duflo. But to say conclusively that there is a correlation in a broader sense is probably impossible. On the other hand, I have not found any research that point to men being more fit for office. Anne Phillips, one of the frontrunners in research in these topics, says in The Politics of Presence in 1995, "There are particular needs, interests and concerns that arise from women's experience, and these will be inadequately addressed in a politics that is dominated by men. Equal rights to a vote have not proved strong enough to deal with this problem. There must also be equality among those elected to office." So the person that thinks we should just focus on electing the person suitable for the job, no matter of the gender, should see this development as positive. not for any individually elected leader, but for the trend. Choosing from the entire population and not just half of it should indicate that we elect more suited leaders. The other problem is that if you think that representation just isn't important, you are most likely part of the majority. I have a hard time imagining if the US had elected 45 consecutive female presidents, men wouldn't call for the importance of electing a male president. Representation should be important for all of us, no matter if you are part of the majority or the minority. But of course, an underrepresented group isn't going to be as obvious to you if you aren't a part of it. Another point often made, especially in regards to quota systems, that by law or policy allocate seats to women, is that focusing on women's representation takes agency away from the elected women. That knowing you fill the seat allocated for women will just enforce a role of being unworthy or inferior male colleagues. This is, to be fair, also the view of many women in politics and business. And when given two options, reaching gender balance or close to it by policy or by natural development, the latter is probably to prefer. But firstly, we have seen that women's issues can be addressed much more adequate with women represented in politics, and these issues are sometimes matter of life and death, especially in poorer nations. Addressing issues like violence against women and women's role in the family and in the community can make huge differences. Maybe quotas can be a reasonable compromise to achieve greatly needed political change, at least for the time being. And secondly, as we have seen, national parliaments are highly dominated by men. Can we really trust that all of them have received their position purely on merits? But let me also be clear on that gender quotas are most efficient in political systems where female candidates are rejected by the voters, and less well in a system where there is just a lack of female candidates. To elect women who will act as good legislators and leaders will take time, if women are far behind men in terms of education and experience. But it is difficult to know what should or must come first, since they both affect the other. Let me know in the comments, in a nice tone, your view on these issues. This video, like all on similar topics, will most likely get a lot of downvotes. So if you enjoyed the content, consider leaving a thumbs up so we can get a more balanced view. Thank you so much for watching.